This is the Permaculture Podcast. I'm Scott Mann. My guest today is Ben Goldfarb, who joins me to talk about his book, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. Drawing from his work and our experiences in resource management, conservation, and environmental education, we talk about the role beavers had in creating and shaping the landscape, history, and people of the United States, and the importance of reintroducing and protecting beavers to return the world to the wetter, boggier place it once was. Enjoy this conversation with Ben, and I'll join you again afterward.
My background briefly is I worked in ecology for a while. I worked for the National Park Service briefly, doing invasive fish control. I tagged sea turtles in North Carolina. I did urban forestry research in the Bronx. So I had sort of this environmental background. And after doing that for a few years, I kind of got into journalism, writing about nature and environmental science and ecology. And then a few years ago, I was working for a magazine called High Country News, which is a really wonderful magazine that covers environmental issues throughout the American West. And while I was there, I was living in Seattle, and I happened to meet this guy named Kent Woodruff, he's a wildlife biologist in central Washington in a place called the Methow Valley. And Kent was then the director of the Methow Beaver Project. And basically what the Methow Beaver Project does is they trap nuisance beavers, beavers that are flooding people's property or cutting down their trees or what have you on private property. And they relocate these beavers to public land, to the headwaters of the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest in central Washington. So I spent about a week with Kent and his crew relocating beavers and visiting sites where they had moved beavers to. And the thing that was so powerful being with Kent, who's a really amazing interpreter of landscape and just an incredible guide to wildlife and forests and ecosystems. I mean, the thing that was so compelling was that the places where they had put beavers were just completely transformed. I think that a lot of people, myself included, have this vision of a stream as this narrow, clear, babbling brook, trickling over the rocks. You could wade right through it or jump right across it. And the places that Kent had moved beavers were nothing like that, right? There were these sprawling marshes and swamps, and the water was really sluggish and dark, and the bottom was covered in silt, and it smelled kind of funky because there was lots of, dead and dying vegetation. And this epiphany, I guess, dawned on me with Kent's help, which was that this was really what most of North America looked like. That our sort of Platonic conception of a stream as this babbling brook is really a historical artifact caused by the elimination of beavers from so many places. So I think it was sort of that realization, that everything I thought I knew about what a stream should look like was wrong because I was forgetting beavers. And that turned into a few articles for High Country News, and that eventually became a book with Chelsea Green's help.
What you just said reminds me a lot of the places that I've gone through over the years when it comes to my exposure to beaver. And it was, though you wouldn't necessarily know it looking at me, as I kind of have this middle-aged dad appearance, I have spent a good bit of time in the woods small game hunting. I've enjoyed fishing over the years and a lot of outdoor sportsman-style activities. And then there was an opportunity to go get a trapper's license. And while we were there, the game wardens, though I think they're actually called fish and wildlife officers now, were talking about what's involved in trapping beaver because we still have them here in Pennsylvania. And they were getting into how dangerous trapping beaver are for individuals because of needing to set lines underwater and all these other really crazy things, which made me want to look into the ecology of these animals more. And it was as I did so, I had young children at the time, so we wound up watching a PBS documentary on beavers and getting to see these giant dams. And it was also about that same time that Platonic conception that you reference is also interesting because I was taking a master's program in park and resource management. And so we were looking at the history of resource management in the United States and how until about the last 50 years or so, that there's been this idea of like the static wilderness that we're seeing in the modern era as Gifford Pinchot and others were establishing the Park Service, thinking about natural landscapes, that they were looking at the landscape that had already been transformed from the 17th through the 19th century, that had removed all of these apex predators, that had removed the ecosystem engineers like the beavers. And now it's only been, in these last couple of decades that we're getting to understand what impact they had in creating the abundance that we now have as kind of the legacy of their space in North America.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that your point about Pinchot and others sort of perpetuating this idea of a static landscape is a really good point because, I mean, beavers do many things, but stasis is not one of them, right? Beavers are these incredible agents of stream dynamism. They force streams onto their floodplain. They create multiple channels. They form islands. A beaver ecosystem is this inherently shifting protean thing, right? I mean, you've got this amazing cycle where they build a dam, they create a pond. Over the course of years or decades or centuries, depending on the kind of the system, the pond fills in with sediment, gradually becomes a wetland, then a wet meadow, then a forest again, and the cycle kind of restarts, right? So beavers are these incredible agents of just shifting ecosystems and landscapes. And the problem with that is that we humans tend to prefer things pretty static, right? We like our roads and our railroads and our power lines and our towns and our farms to basically stay put. And beavers are kind of a countervailing force against that. So it's no wonder that beavers and humans don't always get along super well. And I think that we have kind of fundamentally different visions of how a landscape should work.
And that dynamic nature of the landscape is an interesting one as we try to have these conversations now in the 21st century about landscape restoration, or even just allowing a space to return to its natural cycles, be that beavers or forest fires or allowing predators to roam. And in encountering some of this modern nature writing, which is kind of new to me, to kind of rediscover this, as a lot of my reading was first around the big game hunting of Hemingway and others during the beginning of the 20th century, then reading Aldo Leopold and the Sand County Almanac, the writings of Rachel Carson. And then it was just like my love of nature just took me out into the world. And then being reintroduced to this writing through your work, which is just, I'll admit, I'm a huge fan of your book because it's not only poignant, because the impacts of these ecosystem engineers and the changes that they can have in creating a dynamic regenerative landscape that's needed now, but also it's funny. Some of the things you say, like, if you want to fix the landscape, there's a beaver for that. And what you're saying about beavers, and then Dan Flores when it comes to coyotes, or like in the Beekeeper's Lament about even though bees are not native, the impacts that they have on human food systems, and the things that we can do now to make a difference, but also understanding that if we're going to do this, that in the case of bees, people are going to get stung. In the case of coyotes, yes, there's going to be some predation. And as you were saying in the case of beavers, that they're going to cause flooding and change floodplains in the way that we move water. But what can we do to live differently to account for that and allow this space for these animals that will benefit us in so many ways?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up Aldo Leopold because in some ways I think that us contemporary nature writers are basically just trying to complete the work that he began. I mean, his obviously so he has so many wonderful contributions to the fields of ecology and nature writing and just thinking about the world that we live in. And obviously that one of his seminal works that I always come back to, and I'm sure many other people do too, is the whole thinking like a mountain concept, right? The notion that when you remove predators, there are profound impacts on vegetation and thus erosion, and that predators are really responsible for structuring ecosystems in a very profound way, and that when we lost those predators in this fit of cleaning up the land for sheep and cattle and hunters and deer, we did a lot of profound harm. And I think that beavers are much the same way, right? We didn't, we had this very myopic conception of them as hats, right? That's what they were. They were pelts that we could turn into fashionable Victorian top hats. And of course, we fail to recognize just how essential they are for structuring North American ecosystems, for providing habitat, for storing water, for cycling nutrients, for doing all of these incredibly vital ecological, hydrological, even geological functions. And I think that in a lot of ways, what I'm trying to do in this book is, do for beavers what Aldo Leopold did for wolves and coyotes, to acknowledge that these are truly essential animals, that removing them had incredibly deleterious effects, and that bringing them back can help us solve all kinds of problems. So in a lot of ways, I mean, I went to the Yale School of Forestry. Aldo Leopold is our most famous alumnus. This past fall, I spent a month at his former house in New Mexico doing a residency, and just the chance to kind of follow his path. I mean, he's obviously this sort of inimitable genius whose heights I can never hope to achieve. But I do draw a lot of inspiration from him, and I'm glad you cited him as kind of a touchstone, because he is one for me as well.
And it's all the work. I went to Slippery Rock University here in Pennsylvania for their Parks and Recreation program. And as part of our conversation there was about the different ways that we can approach our understanding of the landscape. And a lot of it is rooted in Otto Leopold's land ethic. And then, the way that we can build and grow upon that in the time since that was written with changing laws and landscapes, but to update that and continue to use that idea that he presented as a way to interact and see the world. And it's such a useful lens as someone who cares about not only humanity, but also all of the other than human and the landscape.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that I think that, the land ethic is basically right. It's just, it's do unto the land as you would have done unto you, right? It's extending the golden rule to sort of non-human communities. And that's exactly what we need, I think, in the beaver context as well. I'm certainly not a hardline anti-trapper, right? I talked to many trappers in the course of writing this book, and I have nothing but respect for their ecological and biological knowledge. I think a lot of them view themselves as conservationists, that they are conservationists in a sense. But I also think that in many cases our trapping regulations aren't really aligned with how powerful and important these animals are. I think that, there's a case that I talk about in the book, where in Wyoming there's a place where the Forest Service is trying to reintroduce beavers to create habitat for waterfowl. And meanwhile, the state agency, the Department of Game and Fish, is continuing to allow beavers to be trapped in the same area. So you've got the federal agency reintroducing beavers, and the state agency immediately trapping them out, or allowing them to be trapped out. And I just think that we need to extend our land ethic, or our sense of land ethic, to beavers, and to sort of recognize that, hey, these guys are more than nuisances, and they are more than pelts. They're these dynamic landscape shapers and influencers, and we can have some trapping, but also recognize that the services that beavers are providing us are worth many, many thousands of dollars per animal, and the pelt is worth $10. So from a simple sort of ecosystem services cost benefit analysis standpoint, these animals are really worth a tremendous amount more alive than they are dead. And how can we align our regulatory systems to acknowledge that fact?
With our backgrounds, I think that we could get into a very technical conversation about agency capture and, the way to value natural resources and whether a financial figure is the right way to do it.
Right. And that's one thing that I kind of bumped into again and again working in this book was I'm constantly writing about how valuable beavers are. And that's still kind of a utilitarian framework, right? I'm still talking about beavers as this tool, or this thing that we can manipulate to do our bidding, to filter out our pollution and store our irrigation water, and, create habitat for ducks so that we can shoot them. I think talking in that kind of ecosystem services language is helpful and important for a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise care about beavers. But at the same time, I mean, they're also just amazing animals, right? They're these incredible, unbelievably industrious, brilliant engineers. And watching them do their work. I here in Northampton, I live near a really spectacular beaver pond where the beavers are pretty well acclimated to people, and they kind of go about their business whether you're watching them or not, which is sort of unusual, right? Beavers are generally pretty shy and retiring, so we have a nice acclimated beaver colony, and just watching them, it's just it's so inspiring and moving and poignant in a lot of ways. I mean, they're just extraordinary animals. that sort of expand our conception of what non-human species are capable of. So that, they have a lot of virtues beyond their simple usefulness to us. So I don't want to perpetuate the ecosystem services thing too much, but it is kind of a useful framework to talk about these things.
And I think about that framework for our conversations with land managers, homeowners, politicians, policymakers. But then I also think about the environmental education side and some of the work of people like David Orr and David Sobel about just creating a love for creatures like beavers and about, talking about those connections that we can have with animals and the landscape, and especially for children, so that we're not introducing tragedies at a young age, but instead encouraging hope and dreams and a love of the natural world. And I'm wondering, we talked about some where you encountered beavers and started writing about them, but when did you fall in love with beavers and really feel engaged and called by this work and the creation of this book?
I think that certainly I've fallen much more in love with beavers during the course of writing this book, but I always felt like I had a beaver connection. I think that I was primed to write this book by past experience in a lot of ways. I remember when I was probably maybe I was 19 or 20 years old, and I was in Glacier National Park, and I was at Two Medicine Lake, which is a really amazing lake and a beautiful campground. And I got up, at 5 o'clock in the morning to fish, and I ended up encountering a pair of beavers, a mated pair at their lodge on Two Medicine Lake, and they were just grooming each other with such fastidious devotion and care, and they're beavers generally made for life. They're monogamous, they're faithful, they're very family oriented, and just seeing these beavers just engaged in this incredibly human act of love toward each other, that was a really powerful moment that I think sort of initiated my interest in beavers and my adoration for them, or my admiration for them too. I think that the thing that makes beavers really easy to fall in love with is that their behaviors are so complex, right? I mean, if you go bird watching, yes, there is a chance that you might experience some kind of amazing bird behavior, but more likely you're just going to hear the bird somewhere in the forest, and you're not going to really have a true encounter with it. Whereas, beavers they're just, when you watch them work, their behaviors are just so elaborate, right? They're obviously felling trees, they're building dams, they're creating canals. People don't really think about beavers as canal builders, but they're incredible diggers, and they make these really extraordinary, elaborate canal networks. So watching a beaver is in some ways fundamentally different from watching most other animals, right? Because they just do so much. And this year in Northampton, this beaver colony that we've been visiting, it seems like every time we go there, their canals are a little bit longer. The kind of the spider web has extended deeper into the forest. They've cut down trees over here, they've dragged some over there. You're never quite sure, what are they thinking? What are they doing? What is the point of this particular little ancillary dam that they created over here to store a little bit extra water there? They're doing so much, and their behavior and their activities is so endlessly interpretable, and you can just interact with them in a different way than you can other species. So from that standpoint, I think that they're a fantastic gateway into the kind of love and devotion that you're talking about. I think that they're just a wonderful way to connect with nature and to empathize with this animal that, like us humans, modifies its environment. There are really very few other species that so deliberately engineer their surroundings. It's a very human impulse, right, to modify your environment to maximize your own food and shelter. So I think that we can just connect with beavers in a way that it's hard to connect with other species, and I love that about them.
I think what you said there as you opened what you just shared about birds and birding, is an important distinction, because it was one of the things when I started doing some bird watching, realizing that many of the birds that I would want to see, I'm likely not to, and how important it is to learn bird calls so that when you're out looking for them, because they are elusive and may alight on a branch that you're not looking at the time and hear them call, that's where that interaction comes. But with beavers, because they have a sense of place once they start dam building and establishing their lodge, that you can see the trees that have been chewed down on the edges of the waterways, that you can see the dam that they've built, you can see the lodge and the other animals that are brought into that space, even if you never see the beavers themselves, that you can see the impacts of the changes that they've made to the landscape around us. And just, yeah, it is an interesting point.
There aren't many opportunities we have to watch geologic processes unfold in human timescales, right? I mean, most of the forces that created our world are layers of sediment being deposited over millions of years, whereas beavers modify landscapes in the course of a single season. So there aren't too many other chances to actually watch our surroundings change like they do in beaver complexes.
What were some things that you learned along the way that were really interesting, that stood out, or that were surprising that you didn't know before you went into writing this book?
I think that as an ecologist or a person whose background is primarily in ecology, I didn't realize fully how important beavers are to our own sort of historical story as Americans. That beavers are just unbelievably crucial to American history in all kinds of ways. I mean, first, of course, that they were intimately tied to indigenous American history. So many Native American tribes have some kind of beaver spiritual connection. Certainly, many tribes used beaver in some way. And then, upon European arrival, beavers were along with cod and timber, the motivating resource that just drove so many historical events. It was when the Pilgrims showed up, they owed a lot of money to their creditors back in England. The only way they could pay back their debts was by trading for pelts with Native Americans and shipping those furs back to Europe. So beavers made possible the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony. The Louisiana Purchase was motivated by the desire to secure new trapping grounds. It was beaver traders and trappers who discovered the route that became the Oregon Trail. Basically, everything that happened really before the Civil War, which loosely coincides timing-wise with the fall of the fur trade, was in some way motivated by beavers. And of course that's lots of things that we sort of look back on favorably or fondly, and then lots of really horrible things happen because of beavers too. There were smallpox epidemics, among the Plains tribes, among the Blackfeet and the Mandan and other tribes that were spread by beaver traders moving up the Missouri River. So it was that fur trade that really perpetrated a lot of the tragedies that befell Native Americans at the hands of white people. So beavers, in some ways, they're behind so many important events, both wonderful and horrible. They're just this integral part of our story as a nation and as a culture and as a people. I don't think I fully appreciated that before I started working on the book.
One of the things that really stood out to me, and it's interesting because of my background in resource management, is at very often the park scale. Someone might rise up through the system and perhaps run a statewide organization or, a large national park, but it tends to be a particular space, place, and time. And in reading your book and some of the other modern nature writing, it really stood out to me how many of these animals were here when colonists and Europeans first arrived. How many ponds and lakes there are in North America just because some beavers decided to build a dam there. And I was really just amazed at how many animals were harvested for the fur trade. And now we have such a reduced number that we're trying to reintroduce and bring back into the landscape to start to make North America a bit wetter and boggier.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you read historical accounts of explorers and trappers moving across the continent, it's mind blowing just how wet the landscape was. You have Lewis and Clark talking about traveling up the Missouri and seeing beaver dams up every tributary as far as the eye could see to the mountains. You have explorers describing moving across Indiana and not being able to find a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers have just so fully ponded everything up. You just had this landscape that was completely dominated by these animals, and we've come so far from that. But at the same time, I think that how we're doing from a kind of a beaver influence and conservation standpoint really depends on the timescale you use. So when Europeans arrived in North America, nobody knows how many beavers there were, but there were probably several hundred million. The best estimate is between 60 and 400 million. So a pretty wide range, but certainly that's a lot of beavers. By the turn of the 20th century, there were only 100,000 beavers left in North America, almost all of them in Canada. So the numbers were just drastically reduced by the fur trade. And today, thanks to conservation laws and reintroductions and economic forces that led to decline in trapping, we probably have about 15 million beavers in North America. So that's a 150-fold increase from their nadir. That's a really wonderful accomplishment, right? I mean, beavers are actually one of our great conservation success stories, and it's really beavers that we have to thank for many of our conservation laws. It was the decline of beavers, along with passenger pigeons and bison and other species during the so-called age of extermination, that made us wake up and realize that natural resources are finite, that we're capable of exterminating God's creation. So beavers are really a wonderful conservation success story if your barometer is, let's say, 1900. But if your barometer is 1500, then yeah, certainly we have only a tiny fraction of the beaver population that we historically had. So how many beavers are appropriate on the landscape, and how many beavers North America can support today is a really big question, and one that many scientists are investigating, because obviously the human footprint is so vast. We've drained so many wetlands, we've paved over so many floodplains, that getting back to 400 million beavers is obviously impossible. But there is certainly some number between our current 15 million and the theoretical 400 million that is feasible. And what's an appropriate number? How many beavers can we support? How many beavers do we need to reap more of their ecosystem benefits and services? Those are all big questions.
And all of those questions are the kinds of things that I was hoping would be raised in this conversation for listeners to consider and ponder, because it's one of the places where I'm interested in this. One of my mentors, who's also been a guest on the show, Wilson Alvarez, he and I had a conversation that was released at the beginning of the year about some work that he's doing to replicate the mechanical action of many of North America's ecosystem engineers. So for him, those are beavers, wolves, ancient humans, and the elephants and other pachyderms that used to roam North America. And so it's, how can we take the lessons of those animals that are no longer necessarily in all these spaces and replicate what they did to the landscape as human beings to engineer what's around us? But then I see the intersection in this conversation about what we can do to support the growth and reintroduction of the animals that do still exist. And also for permaculture practitioners, because it is a holistic system of design that looks at both the micro and the macro, from the impact of the individual household all the way up to humanity in the biosphere, that what can we do to take the lessons of ecology, as well as the work of people like Ian McHarg and his book Design with Nature, that was talking all about placing humans in places where they minimize our impact on the natural world around us. And in considering all of these things, how can we design for a future that includes more of the natural world wherever we are, that we can both protect, enjoy, and expand the habitat for all of these animals, as well as living rich, rewarding lives connected to them and with them?
That's one of the great questions of our time, obviously. I mean, I'm certainly the furthest thing from a permaculturist or a permaculture expert, but I do think that in terms of designing systems that mimic nature and that work with nature, beavers have a lot to teach us. So one of my favorite stories in the book that I encountered in Nevada, and Nevada is actually this kind of surprising hotbed of pro-beaver activity among farmers and ranchers. It's this very conservative state that you wouldn't really think of as being a place where beavers are appreciated. But because it's such a dry place, anything that's capable of storing and saving water is a huge asset. So there's this amazing cluster of pro-beaver ranchers in northeast Nevada who have become real leaders in working with beavers to achieve forage production for their cattle and water storage for their homes and their pastures. So the example that I love to talk about is there's this giant ranch in northeast Nevada called the Wine Cup Gamble Ranch. It's about the size of Rhode Island, and the ranch manager there is this guy named James Rogers, who's a very smart, progressive, funny, beaver-loving guy. And they have a pretty sizable beaver population on their property. So most of their irrigation water on the Wine Cup Gamble used to come from this giant dam called the 21-mile dam. It was this huge sort of earth dam. And this past winter, the dam blew out during a flood, and they lost this giant source of irrigation water. But what James is talking about now, instead of rebuilding this big centralized monolith, is actually designing and engineering lots of smaller wetlands all over the property, which will be maintained and inhabited by beavers. So instead of having all of the irrigation water in a single place behind this one giant dam, he's talking about this decentralized, beaver-based, wetland-oriented system where, he's storing a couple 100-acre feet over here and a few hundred more over there and maybe 1,000 over there. And beavers are a really important part of that system. I think that's the kind of solution that to me just makes so much sense. You're moving from this. I mean, we know so much about the kind of destructive impact that mega dams have on the environment, and I love the idea of moving from this kind of centralized water management system to this much more dispersed, decentralized, natural, beaver mimicking one that actually relies on the rodents themselves to do a lot of the maintenance. And I think that's the kind of solution that more people are talking about, from all the way from farmers to state water managers. I think these kinds of decentralized ideas are coming to the fore, and I think that beavers have a lot to teach us about how those systems should work and function.
In addition to reading your book, which gives such a wonderful overview of the history of beavers in North America, the impacts of people on beavers, the conservation movement now in the modern era, are there any additional resources, such as other books or organizations, that you suggest people connect with if they'd like to learn more about beavers and what they can do to help support this repatriation into the North American landscape?
Yeah, there are a lot of great resources out there. So I think that there's a pretty new group that has a lot of great resources and information called the Beaver Institute. And the Beaver Institute is run by a guy named Mike Callahan. And Mike has a great story. He was a former physician's assistant who actually became kind of enamored of beavers about 20 years ago and sort of turned himself into one of the country's foremost beaver coexistence experts. So what he does is, he basically goes around. If you complain about beavers flooding your yard or clogging up your culvert or whatever, Mike will come out and install this pipe and fence system called a flow device, which basically drains the beaver pond to a manageable level so you can protect your property or your infrastructure, but leave the beavers in place and maintain some amount of pond and wetland. So Mike is a really great guy and has this new nonprofit called the Beaver Institute, which has a lot of helpful resources. So that's a good place to start. There's a group out in California called Worth a Dam. A lot of good puns in the beaver world. You'll notice, as you're not surprised. A lot of dam puns out there. So Worth a Dam is based in Martinez, California. It's run by a woman named Heidi Perryman, who about 10 years ago saved a colony of beavers that moved into the town of Martinez. The town wanted to trap them out. Heidi basically organized this really wonderful advocacy campaign and saved them. And in the course of doing that, she became really a remarkable beaver scholar herself. And her nonprofit, Worth a Dam, is kind of this comprehensive beaver news and information source that is really indispensable to every beaver lover. Every beaver lover in America is aware of Heidi. She's quite a forceful and wonderful personality. So Worth a Dam and the Beaver Institute, those are two great places to start for beaver resources.
I think that I could talk to you for at least another hour about this, but as always happens with interviews, we seem to run out of time so quickly. And so before we do draw this to a close, do you have any final thoughts for the listeners?
I think that when you think about a beaver, I think a lot of people tend to imagine it in the wilderness somewhere, swimming in a pristine pond with a snow-capped mountain in the background. But more and more beavers, I mean, beavers are these urban animals that live in very close proximity to people. There are hundreds of beavers in Portland and Seattle, and there were beavers in Staten Island earlier this year. A family moved into Staten Island. There are beavers in the Bronx. It's really incredible the way that these creatures have come back into our lives. And to me, I think it's so important that we make a little space for them. That the benefits they provide us are so extreme and wonderful. And if we can just learn to tolerate them, to coexist with them in these suburban and urban settings, we can just achieve so much. So that's a drum that I'm always beating, is to imagine beavers as this more urban, cosmopolitan, ubiquitous species than we give them credit for, and to make a little space for them, even in our densely settled urban and suburban areas.
And that was Ben Goldfarb. Find out more about his work at bengoldfarb.com and his book, Eager, at chelseagreen.com. What I love about this conversation is the way Ben talks about beavers and how we can connect to the world through the stories of others. As I mentioned, and he and I touched on, there is a deep value in good nature writing and how it can move us. Beautifully written, we can hear the sound of a beaver's tail on the water or the concern of a conservationist to ensure a mother and her kit stay together. Through those words, we get a sense of place and a loving bond with the other than human that we may never know personally or get a chance to visit. We can care about something beyond ourself or our local biome. If you'd like to read some of the best nature writing available, start with Ben's book. It is absolutely fantastic and one of the finest books I've read in years, as he leads us through the importance of beavers in a fun, witty, and captivating way. You'll learn as much about beavers as you will the people, organizations, and history of human contact and interaction with these charismatic ecosystem engineers. If you'd like to read more writing like this, I then suggest you check out Dan Flores, who wrote the foreword for Eager, and Dan's book, Coyote America, A Natural and Supernatural History. And after that, The Beekeeper's Lament by Hannah Nordhaus. Both are excellent looks at the different connections between our lives and those of other animals, both wild and domestic. Should you like to learn more about the other than human and how we interact with that side of the world, read David Abrams' The Spell of the Sensuous. This book has had one of the most significant impacts on me and my understanding of how interrelated our relationships are with the sun and sky, earth and water, fish, fowl, insects, and mammals. How we are not alone, cannot live alone, and would not be human without them. Spend each day looking for the impacts of rural beavers and their cosmopolitan siblings while taking care of Earth, yourself, and each other.